All right, welcome insiders. Robert Warbeck, greetings from scenic Pennsylvania. Hi, Robert. How you doing? Um, I got your birthday present, by the way. Thank you. That's awesome. We'll talk about that later. uh, Hi, guys. It's Chief Experience Officer Justin Rivers with you today with Jeff Gold. We are going to be talking about Jeff's book, Sittin' In. I do have a chat all ready to go with a link to the book. As soon as Jeff gets started, I'll put that in there. The
I'm here.
paste here. All right. Robin, hi from the lovely Berkshire. So yeah, insiders, you know the drill. You can say hello if you'd like, but we have a lot of great stuff to talk about with Jeff's book. Jeff and I are going to do like we do with book talks a lot. We're going to have a discussion, a back and forth. Also, I am going to be driving the presentation while Jeff speaks. So what I'm going to do very quickly is I'm going to let you all get a look at Jeff. He can introduce himself, and then we'll come back to the presentation that I have up. Before I turn it over to Jeff, I would just like to say that I have the privilege of receiving a copy of Jeff's book. The hard copy came about 4 or 5 days ago, and it is amazing. I know you've heard me say that about other books, but I could not put this down, mainly because I am a big music fan. I performed music when I was in high school and in college as well, not jazz, but great affinity for it. But I learned so much about the New York jazz scene from this book. And you may or may not know this, but I'm trying to make your holiday gift shopping a little easier. So if you have jazz fans or New York history fans in your life, or just fans who love photography and ephemera, this book is amazing. Hi, Klaus. How you doing? From Flatiron. Nancy. How you doing, Nancy? Good to see you again. I saw you in person a couple days ago. So, Jeff, why don't you, let me stop the share. Why don't you say hello to yourself, and then we'll go into the presentation. You can also intro the book if you want at this point too, and I'll put the link up to buy the book in the chat. So go ahead.
Great. Well, so my book is called Sittin' In, Jazz Clubs of the 1940s and 50s. And it's based around an archive I found of souvenir photos from jazz clubs, which look like this. So if you went to a jazz club in the 40s or 50s, they would have someone roaming around the club photographing the patrons at their tables, and they'd go in the back room and develop them in a quickie dark room, sometimes in a closet, and bring them out in a little custom portfolio and sell it to you for $1 at the end of the night as a souvenir. And I have a business buying and selling rock and roll and jazz and blues and music memorabilia and rare records. And in my travels, I discovered somebody who had an archive of these, almost 200 of them, and bought them. And I had never seen a single one of these in many decades of doing this. And as I was buying them, I thought, this is a book. If I haven't seen these, I can't imagine many people have. And some of them document the artists posing with the patrons. The patrons would ask the artists to come over and pose for a picture. So here is Duke Ellington with an actress from the era named Joan Davis and a soldier whose identity we don't know. And it's signed by Cab Calloway and Duke Ellington. So obviously Cab Calloway was in the club as well. And these are kind of a primordial version of celebrity selfies. I can't think of any version earlier than that. And in doing the book, I discovered, after I decided to do it, I thought, well, I'm not an expert on these clubs. I got to talk to some people who were there. And if you were in clubs at the end of the 40s, even if you were sneaking in, as a couple of the people I talked to were, because they were slightly underage, you're 90 years old now. So this is going to be an impossible task to get eyewitness accounts of these clubs in 10 or 15 years, just because there won't be anybody alive anymore. So I spoke to Quincy Jones, who I would imagine everybody knows who that is, Sonny Rollins, who's probably the most famous jazz musician alive, Dan Morgenstern, who's the preeminent historian in jazz in the world, and he is 90, as is Sonny, and Quincy's 80, the very young 87. He came a little later in the early 50s. And Dan Morgenstern had a really interesting story. He was a refugee from Nazi Germany, came to America in 1947, came to New York, and started hitting these clubs immediately as a fan, and became the preeminent historian in the world on jazz, and ran the Rutgers Jazz Institute for nearly 30 years. So that's what the book is. And because New York was and is the dominant center of jazz for much of the 20th century, more than half the book is dedicated to clubs in New York, and the rest of the book is clubs around the country.
Cool. Yeah, and it's again, I picked apart the New York section. It's really great. And the intro, the way you paint the introduction of how you found it in a safe deposit box, you know, all of this stuff that you were just like a treasure trove of items here, really was just, it brought me in immediately. And the way the book is designed graphically is really great. Like the graphic design is really quite elegant and fun and jazzy. You know, it's colorful, it's bright, it's
you know, I'll say one other thing, which is,
yes, go ahead.
I had done 2 books before, one on classic vinyl records and one on the history of Iggy Pop's band, the Stooges, which invented punk rock. And I'd sworn off ever doing another book again because it's just so much work.
It's a lot of work.
When I found these and bought them, I kind of engaged in this battle of wills between this stack of these souvenir photos and my resolve never to do another book. And the more I Googled around and looked, I found there literally are no books on jazz clubs that have ever been done. And there are no books of these photographs. And there are none of them online. And eventually, the battle of wills was won by this stack of these photos, because I thought I kind of owe it to history to document this. And when I started doing the math and realizing that, you know, you got to be 90 years old to have participated in this scene, I feel kind of very lucky that the inanimate objects wore me down, because it is a document of a scene that's going to be impossible to document firsthand pretty quickly.
Yeah, and well worth it too. It's great. All right, why don't we jump right into it? I'm going to bring the presentation back up. We'll start it from the beginning. There's the cover. So let's talk about this first photo. And so why don't you begin by just giving us a little rundown on how jazz comes to New York? Because like so many things, you know, jazz isn't kind of born in New York. It just really gets better and solidified in New York after it comes from where it comes from. So why don't you tell us a little bit about its journey from New Orleans via...
Yeah, so one of the things I discovered while doing this book was the development of jazz is driven by both music and equally by external circumstances. So jazz starts in the red light district of New Orleans, which is called Storyville, in basically saloons and dens of prostitution, where musicians who play ragtime and blues and second line marches start melding this music together. And in 1917, the United States enters World War I. And pretty quickly, the Army and Navy become concerned because a lot of their new recruits are getting drunk and high and entangled with prostitutes in Storyville. And so they force the city of New Orleans to close down this red light district, which leaves a lot of jazz musicians out of work. So coincident with that is the first wave of the Great Migration, where African Americans move out of the racist South for better jobs that are created by the war. There are munitions manufacturers and meat packers, and all kinds of businesses go into high gear to produce supplies for the war. And this creates jobs in the industrial centers of the United States. And Chicago is one. It's the railroad hub of the United States. So as lots of African Americans are moving up to Chicago for jobs, lots of African American musicians are moving from New Orleans, where their jobs have been taken away from them as Storyville's been closed down, up to Chicago. And the great jobs that have been, or the good jobs that have been created by the war mean that people have a lot more spending money, there are a lot more clubs, and the second great center of jazz becomes Chicago. Then another one of these external circumstances happens in 1920, when Prohibition gets enacted and alcohol is made illegal. And bars are closed all around the United States, but Chicago is the hub of bootlegging, led by Al Capone, the biggest gangster and bootlegger in the United States. And Chicago has this flourishing culture of speakeasies, illegal clubs serving alcohol. Some of them are owned by Capone, and Capone was a jazz fan and insisted that these clubs hire only black jazz musicians because he felt they had been persecuted as his Italian-American relatives had been, or Italian relatives had been. So from 1920 to 1930, the hub of jazz is in Chicago. 1931, the US government finally is able to put Al Capone in jail for income tax evasion. And this is another external circumstance that drives the evolution of jazz. And there's St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which is a gang war, happens in 1929. They put Capone away finally in 1931. A wave of reformers is elected in Chicago city government, and they close down lots of speakeasies. And so the jazz musicians, again, looking for a place to move, to get employment, go to New York. And in New York, there's a pretty big speakeasy scene, and most of them moved to Harlem, which is the main African-American neighborhood at the time. And in the 20s, late 20s, a scene of clubs has opened in Harlem where jazz is being played. Well, I'm going to put a pause on that now because I know we're going to get to some of those clubs, and I'm going to talk about this picture. This picture shows Charlie Parker on the right, who was the greatest jazz saxophonist and innovator in the history of jazz, with a white couple posing at the Royal Roost, which was a club in Manhattan, just off of 52nd Street, which we'll talk about. And it was colloquially known as the Metropolitan Bopera House because it was a bebop music center. And you can just see the Bopera House banner above them. And Parker, as you can see, is posing with a white couple. And one of the things I discovered while doing this book, and it's really a pretty little known fact, is according to Quincy Jones and Sonny Rollins, racism started to break down in Jim Crow America at these clubs, where African-American musicians and white musicians would play together, and African-American patrons and white patrons were welcomed in most of these clubs at the same time. And Quincy Jones said racism would have been over in the 50s if they'd listened to the jazz musicians. And Sonny Rollins told me when I asked him about that, he kind of went on a tear and said, you know, we never get credit. Jazz never gets credit for being a great force for integration. And this picture demonstrates that. I mean, it's 1948, and you can see these white people look very, very happy to be posing with Charlie Parker, who's looking kind of happy and slyly at them. And I think it just is a great physical manifestation of what Sonny and Quincy were telling me.
Yeah, totally. And I think you're right. It's a theme you sense recurring over and over again. And I will say to the insiders, I read the Sonny and the Quincy Jones interviews, and it's great. I didn't realize Quincy Jones was 87. Boy, he's still a fairly youthful 87.
He's really youthful.
Well,
I mean, you guys are all really, really smart and articulate. And it was Sonny I felt like I'd kind of asked him a question that people hadn't asked him, and he was waiting for somebody to ask him. And he went on kind of a long tear about how it was an integrated scene and jazz musicians never get credit for it. And at the end of this tear, he said, I hope you put this in your book. And I said, God, of course I'm going to put this in my book. It's incredible. It really is something that's poorly documented.
Yeah, no, and Quincy Jones had not a bad thing to say about anybody. And I feel like you almost were like prodding him to see if there was any like discord, whether racially or between me. He was like, no, everybody like loved each other, and it was a great scene. And it was
so surprising to me to hear that.
Yeah.
From, and you know, I'd read a lot about this scene by the time I spoke to him, and you know, people kind of skirted around the edges from it, but there's nothing like hearing it from somebody who was there.
Yeah, so true.
And I heard it from Quincy and Sonny, who were on stage and playing these clubs, and I asked Dan Morgenstern about it, who was in the audience, and they all told me essentially the same story.
Really great. Well, let's talk about Harlem then. So,
okay. So this is a great map
awesome.
From the 30s showing the location of various clubs and kind of capturing the ethos of these clubs. And there were in Harlem 3 main clubs, and then lots of, it's estimated that in the 20s to the 30s, there were 5,000 speakeasies in New York and 500 of them in Harlem. And most of them, most of the bigger ones, had musicians for the entertainment, and they would serve bootleg liquor, or some of them would serve setups, which was basically the ingredients for a mixed drink without the alcohol, so you could bring in your own alcohol. The biggest clubs in Harlem were the Cotton Club, which is there in the lower left-hand corner. And that was a segregated racist club owned by a guy named Oni Madden, who was a gangster. Started in 1923. And they had exclusively African-American entertainment. And there were reviews. They would have a comedian and dancers and comedy troupes. And then the headlining would be a jazz band. And they had exclusively African-American entertainment and exclusively white patronage. And it was a very upmarket thing where people would come from downtown and midtown up to Harlem to have a Black experience, essentially. And it's kind of, as I teased out from speaking to Sonny and Quincy and Dan, all of whom were too young to have actually gone there, but talked to many people who did. While it was reprehensible in its admissions policy, the owners paid the acts very well, more than any other place. And the key thing they had was a live radio wire. And so as radio is taking over in America as an entertainment medium in the late 20s and 30s, there was a live from the Cotton Club broadcast every week that went nationally. And the Cotton Club gave very early, important exposure to band leaders, including Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, and Cab Calloway, who were local figures at the time. But the fact that they had this live radio broadcast every week meant that people across the country could hear their music and get turned on to jazz. And so that live radio wire was important in spreading jazz nationally as a phenomenon. It was important in giving those musicians a national profile and allowing them to tour. And it was important in getting them good record deals and their records selling nationally. So while there are a lot of negatives about the Cotton Club, there was some good that came out. And the other main clubs were integrated. Small's Paradise, which started in the late 20s and went through the mid 80s, was in business. At one point owned by Wilt Chamberlain, the basketball star. And that was the main African-American owned club, owned by a guy named Ed Smalls. And then Connie's Inn, which was another club owned by some Lithuanian immigrants. And then there was the Savoy Ballroom, which you can see in the photo right above the Cotton Club. And that was the biggest ballroom and was fully integrated as well. So even in the 1920s, there were integrated clubs in New York, which is pretty unusual.
All right, so let's go. There we go.
So this is a program from the Cotton Club from the 30s, and you can see, stereotyped African Americans, which I guess was less unusual then as it is now, and certainly is very objectionable seen through the eyes of a 2020 viewer. But the Cotton Club would have reviews, and this is one called Cotton Club Parade. I think it was 1932, and you can see the music is by Ted Koehler and Harold Arlen, very famous. And I just wanted to show people the kind of jazz age artwork, which was certainly not enlightened from the Cotton Club. This is a photo from Small's Paradise. I think it's the earliest photo I have in this book. And Smalls was an integrated place owned by an African-American, Ed Smalls, as I mentioned. And if you look at it, you can see in the background in the upper right, there's an African-American woman. So this isn't perhaps the best illustration of how these clubs were integrated, but it's one from the 30s, and we're going to come to some later. This is a 1930s handbill advertising like a mini poster that they would pass out to potential patrons for a barn dance at the Savoy Ballroom. And I just love the evocative artwork too. And Erskine Hawkins, who was a big time African-American band leader, and the Savoy Sultans, who were a big band, house band for the Savoy. And the Savoy had a giant stage with two artists, two orchestras could fit on this stage side by side. So one would finish and the next one would take over. It was very famous for dancing. The Lindy Hop, named after Charles Lindbergh, originated there. And there's an enormous amount about that in the book and online.
Of course, Stomping at the Savoy, which I said has been in my head all afternoon. Thank you. Which is a great song. It's one of my favorites with Louis and Ella.
And so this is a photo from the Savoy Ballroom, and we don't know what year it's from, and we don't know who these people are, as is the case with virtually all these. But you can see it's an integrated group, and it's an integrated group probably in the 1940s. And you know, what an unusual thing that would be to see back then. And as I've said to other people, and as I may have just said before, to me, it's a whole different thing seeing it rather than hearing about it or reading about it. And there it is.
Yeah. It's amazing how comfortable everybody looks too. Like,
yeah, everybody, that's another thing. And I go into that with Quincy and Sonny. Everybody in every one of these pictures looks really, really happy. They're having a great time.
Right.
And I asked them about what it meant for African Americans to go out, because, you know, a lot of these pictures were taken during World War II or just after Prohibition, during the Great Depression. Things were not going great in America.
Right.
And both of them told me that it was such an incredible, jazz and jazz clubs provided an oasis for people where they could put their problems away and let loose and have fun and dress up and get loose. And that it was an incredibly valuable outlet for people. And Sonny said, you know, he actually used the word paradise a number of times. He said these were paradisiacal clubs. It was paradise. The opportunity, and racism obviously still existed outside of the clubs, right, elsewhere in New York, and certainly much more so in other places in the United States. But these clubs provided an early and very important respite from that.
And then, of course, the legendary
Apollo Ball. Yeah. The Apollo, which opened in the early 30s and is still alive and well, and was a very important venue for African-American entertainers. And they booked white entertainers occasionally too, people like Buddy Rich or Gene Krupa's big bands. And they would book celebrities. Boris Karloff, hot off of Frankenstein, appeared there. Buddy Holly appeared there. You can see in just over to the left under the marquee, it's Rochester, it was Eddie Rochester Anderson from the Jack Benny Show. So he was a comedian who would appear at the Apollo. And the Apollo was also very integrated. One of the references I cite said, during the week, it would be 40% white, and on the weekends, it would be up to 75% white. So another early and very important outlet for integration.
Oh, there you go.
Here's a 1950s handbill for Harlem's high spot, the Apollo. And I just love, they would put together multi-artist bills, usually music, but sometimes comedy or sometimes celebrities, as I said. And here we have Eleanor Jacquet, who was a famous jazz saxophonist, Ethel Waters, famous jazz vocalist, Dizzy Gillespie, and lesser known acts, and Johnny Otis with Lester Phillips.
And so now, before you say anything, I just want to jump in and say, what I had said to you when we started this, which was, sort of being a backseat jazz fan in college and through my adult life. I always sort of knew about Harlem and the Village. I went to the Vanguard. I went, actually we used to go to the Iridium a lot, right outside of Lincoln Center, but I never knew about 52nd Street. This was an amazing new bit of information for me. So let's
So,
talk.
as we talked about external circumstances, once again, the center of jazz is in New York, is in Harlem. And there are clubs scattered around elsewhere, and we'll hear about some of them. But in 1935, there are race riots in Harlem. And the perception becomes that it's unsafe for white people to go up to Harlem after that. So a lot of these clubs in Harlem either go out of business because of the lack of people coming from downtown and midtown, or they move downtown. And that's what happened to the Cotton Club, who had a brief stint in midtown, but was closed by 1938. So the next big center of jazz becomes a block and a half area of 52nd Street, which is really was and forever will be the jazz epicenter of the world. And this starts in the late 30s, but really gets going in the 40s. And here you can see a block with probably 15 jazz clubs. The Three Deuces, very famous one, the Carousel, the Club Samoa, the famous Door, which is one of the most famous. And on the left side, Jimmy Ryan's, which was very famous, the Onyx, which was very famous, Tony's, Leon and Eddie's, which was more of a comedy club. But there's a really big concentration of clubs, and people would just go from club to club if they had enough money, and see act after act, and all the most famous artists played there. Charlie Parker, the Oscar Pettiford here, Errol Gardner. This is just a great photo that kind of shows what a concentration there was.
It's such a great evocative photo with the dark wet street. It's like such a great
photo.
It. God, I love this photo. All right.
So one of the clubs was the Onyx. It had four different physical locations. Sometimes these clubs would, landlord would want more money and they'd move 4 doors down. A lot of that was happening. This is the most extreme example with 4 locations. And Billie Holiday played a 3 or 4 month residency at this club. This is a postcard from the Onyx, and I love it because you can see how physically small some of these places were. This club probably fit fewer than 100 people. You can see the bandstand on the left. They all had a bar. This is particularly small, but was one of the most prominent clubs there was. Birdland is probably the most famous of all these clubs. And this is a postcard with 3 views of Birdland. The main room up top, the outdoor marquee to the bottom right, and the bar to the bottom left. And one of the things that really got me about these souvenir photos are, these are the kind of images you see of these clubs. You see the marquee mostly, you see pictures of artists on stage, you see people waiting outside in photographs. Occasionally you'll see an empty club, but you never see who the people were. And that's what these photos, that's the exceptional thing about them, is we get to see the fans who were in the clubs watching stuff. And as we talked about before, many of them just looked ebullient to be seeing jazz. So this was Birdland was around the corner on Broadway, and was probably the most famous jazz club in the world, was and is. It was named after Charlie Parker, whose nickname was Bird, and he played there numerous times. And it was a larger club, but still small enough that when a band played with a lot of players, sometimes they'd have to get rid of some tables and put the piano below the stage in the front.
And of course, the legendary.
So this is a great photo.
This is a really
I was buying these, and I opened this up and went, geez, that's Marlon Brando on the right. And I was talking before about some of these photos, like the one with Charlie Parker, are kind of primordial celebrity selfies. Lots of stars went to Birdland, and this is clearly one for these two couples. Saw Marlon Brando sitting next to them and said, "Hey, can we get a picture with you?" And it's just so great. You know, Morris Levy, the mob-connected frontman and co-owner of Birdland, was a guy that many people have many colorful stories about. He had record labels. He was a concert promoter. He owned a variety of clubs. But one of the most positive things you can say about him is he was completely dedicated to integration. And Birdland was a fully integrated club and was very prestigious venue to play. And Sonny Rollins talks about it, you know, what an amazing experience it was for him, a guy who'd grown up in Harlem and lived in Harlem, going to some of these clubs and having white people come up to him and tell him how great he was, and could they get a photo with him, and could they get his autograph, and he really just had no frame of reference for things like that. So I just love this picture because it really is like a celebrity selfie from today.
Yeah, totally. And before we move downtown to the Village, which I know is next, one of the things that's really also brilliant about the book is that you have, which I know is not represented in the presentation, but you have maps with the exact locations in the neighborhoods of where the clubs were. So as a guide, I absolutely think that that's just, I love maps and I love to know where things were. So it was a real treat for those as well.
Oh, my daughter designed those maps, so I'll pass that on to her.
Oh, please. Oh, tell her I love them. They're great.
I wanted people to be able to see how concentrated this was and where everything was relative to everything else.
And it was really interesting to see that everything sort of concentrated together so people, I guess, could just bounce around to each one if they wanted to. It was just.
So one of the other interesting things is through the 30s, starting in the mid 30s, swing music becomes the dominant form of jazz and really the dominant form of music in the United States.
Yeah.
And swing is characterized by big bands playing very arranged, very precise orchestrations, and there might be 20 or 25 members of a band, and the trombones would all stand up in unison and play exactly the same thing and then sit down, and they had choreography, and it was very tightly scripted. So the musicians, if you were the top horn player, you might get a chance to do a solo or two during a performance, but it was very scripted. And some of the musicians got frustrated by this. And as a result, in jam sessions that took place in Harlem in the early 40s, this new kind of music called bebop started evolving. And bebop was fully improvised. There were no charts. It was all soloing. And it allowed these musicians to break loose. And it was music for listening closely to, whereas swing had been music for dancing to. So in a misguided attempt to raise money for the war effort, the city of New York and then the United States enacted a wartime cabaret tax where they added a 30% surcharge to any venue that had live music with dancing or a vocalist. And most of these swing bands had a vocalist, all of them did. So immediately, this had the unintended consequence of causing club owners to have to raise their prices 30%, which meant that a lot of people couldn't go to these clubs because there was still depression, effects of the depression going on. And that meant a lot of the big bands started breaking up because they couldn't keep 20 or 30 people on payroll with fewer and fewer club engagements because of this wartime tax. And so on 52nd Street, which was the epicenter of jazz in New York at this time, club owners started saying, wait a minute, if we hired some of these bebop bands, which are smaller bands, 4, 5, 6 people, we can pay them less. You're not paying for 25 musicians. And they don't have vocalists, and people don't dance to the music. It's all cerebral. So we can escape paying this cabaret tax by having bebop bands instead of big bands. And so that is yet another external circumstance that ends up changing the direction of jazz. And bebop becomes the predominant music because it's great, but also because it's a way for these club owners to avoid paying this cabaret tax. So bebop really flourishes on 52nd Street, but as with all things changing, in the late 40s and early 50s, prostitution becomes a more dominant thing on 52nd Street. Drugs become a more dominant thing, whereas swing was really music that was about drinking and marijuana for the musicians and some of the fans. Heroin becomes the dominant libation for musicians in the bop era. And a lot of that is because Charlie Parker was a famous heroin addict and he was such a remarkable musician. A lot of younger musicians thought, well, maybe if I take this stuff, I can play like him. And he actively discouraged that, but it happened. So 52nd Street at some point becomes more rough around the edges, strip clubs start opening, and music, a lot of the music scene goes south yet again to Greenwich Village. There you go. So this is a matchbook, but I just love it. I can't imagine.
It's awesome.
From the Village Vanguard, which opens in the mid-30s. A guy named Max Gordon, who was a law student, opens this club and starts off with the intention of it being a poetry club and a club for folk music and comedy. And at some point he starts serving alcohol and gets closed down, so he moves to a different premises. But this is a club that's been around since 1935 and is still going strong today. In the 40s, he started booking more and more jazz acts, small jazz acts, and became very successful with that. And by the time the late 40s, it was a almost entirely jazz club.
And this is, I may have mentioned, I'd been to the Vanguard probably 10 times throughout my college career in the 90s when, I went to Fordham up in the Bronx and we thought we were just the bee's knees by, going downtown and going to the Vanguard, and we had no idea who was even playing. We just wanted to sit there and listen to music.
Anybody played there, Miles Davis.
Oh yeah, no, I know. That's what we wanted to be there where Miles, played and all that stuff. It was just an amazing, and still is. I hope they're doing well through the pandemic. I'm not sure.
I don't know. I don't think anybody's doing well.
No, I know. I just hope they're surviving somehow. I'm not sure how, because that is certainly not a place to go during a pandemic.
Yeah. There are 55 live albums. I found a list online that have been recorded at the Village Vanguard. 2 by John Coltrane, Miles, anybody you can think of.
So it's such a great space. All right.
So this is another really interesting club, Cafe Society. So this opened in 1938 by a guy named Barney Josephson, who was a New York jazz fanatic and a shoe salesman, who had gone on vacation to Prague and Berlin and became entranced by cabaret culture. And he came back and decided, you know what, I'm going to leave the shoe business for show business. I want to start a cabaret in New York. And so he did it using sarcastically the name Cafe Society, which had been coined as a term for the snooty upper crust in New York, and you can see this in the illustrations. And he was very dedicated to civil rights and decided that blacks and whites had to be treated equally at his club. And in fact, sometimes he instructed his people to give the blacks the better tables. And he eventually opened a second location. He famously opened his club with Billie Holiday as a performer. And somebody came to him very soon after he opened and turned him on to this song, Strange Fruit, which had been written by a high school teacher, Abel Meerpole, in reaction to some lynchings in the South. And he thought this was such a remarkable song. He went to Billie Holiday and said, I want you to sing this in your performances. And she kind of pushed back thinking, this isn't going to go over well, a song about lynching. And he had this singular vision for how it would work and said to her, look, here's what I wanted, what I propose. You sing this as the last song in your 3 sets a night. And during the time you sing this, we turn off all the lights except for a pin spotlight on you. And I instruct my servers, no serving of alcohol, no food. We're going to make this a solemn occasion. And she describes in her autobiography how she sang it the first night, and there was just dead silence when she finished. And then one person applauded, and then some more, and then some more. And it became her signature song. And amazingly, it was Marvin Josephson, this shoe salesman turned impresario, who brought it to her and convinced her to do it.
Amazing. So what happens, how do we sort of move out of then sort of the jazz club scene? I'm assuming we get into the 60s and, you know, late 50s and 60s, and now you have rock. So that changes tastes, you know, and that's it.
Yeah, so what happens is there are clubs flourishing at one point or another all over New York.
Mm.
And after the bebop era, hard bop comes out. You know, it's constantly fragmenting and changing, so there are different genres evolving at the time. But in 1956, Little Richard and Chuck Berry start having hits,
right,
and Elvis starts having hits, and rock soon becomes, or you know, early rock becomes the dominant sensation in the United States. And so some promoters start devoting their resources or their clubs to booking rock and rhythm and blues acts, and the media starts covering more of these, and the records start selling more. So jazz begins a bit of a decline, though there's certainly a healthy scene throughout the United States and continues to be, but becomes more of a fringe music, being displaced by rock and roll. And then, of course, 1964, the Beatles come to America, and that becomes, you know, rock and roll just takes over for everything.
Yeah, and you go from these really intimate sort of settings, or you go to arenas, and then, you know, it's MSG, exactly. And you know.
But you know, in the pre and hopefully post-COVID world, there's still a lot of these clubs and a lot of people who enjoy and love this music, and a lot of radio and online resources dedicated to jazz, obviously. And so while the book kind of chronicles the heyday of it in the 40s and 50s, there's still a healthy scene.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Yeah, and I think people are sort of craving to get back. You know, during the pandemic, we felt so isolated, obviously, and they're really craving to get back to those more intimate. I mean, I know I am. Like, I was never a big stadium show guy either. I just like small venues, and I can't wait. I hope they are all doing well, both in theater and in music. It's just, yeah, I mean, such a better experience.
It's interesting. I've been doing interviews for this book, and a lot of people ask me, you know, isn't it strange the timing of this coming out? And it's a book about live music and celebrating live music. And as Sonny Rollins said to me in his interview, when you would play these small clubs, the audience was like an additional member of the band. You were playing with them. Yeah. You were communing with them.
Yeah.
So it's an odd time to release a book about that when all the clubs are closed. And it's an odd time with the summer of Black Lives Matter we had and the protests to release a book that documents an earlier time where that racism was starting to break down. And certainly there's a lot of racism today and in the past, but this was kind of a bright light in that. So it is an interesting time to do that. And I just wanted to mention, and I think you have this in the show notes, I have a website for the book.
Yes.
Called sittinin.com, no G.
I'll put it in again.
in.com. Yeah. And people can see a lot more photographs there. And there's a video, 3.5-minute video where we flip through the book so you can really get an idea of just how many of these photographs there are and how evocative it is. And there's a playlist also that you could click on the link and listen to 4 hours of music on Spotify that is kind of a soundtrack to the book.
Which I cooked to last night. It was great. I love to listen to music when I cook. Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. And this was a really amazing conversation, Jeff. So thank you. Does anybody have questions for Jeff about the book or about jazz. I see Elliot put a couple of comments here. I read somewhere that bored rich folks from Lower Manhattan would often visit the Cotton Club, and that it was chic to do so. I think you put that in right before Jeff said that. So
yeah, very much. That's exactly the scene.
yeah,
I don't know if they were bored, but yeah, they were rich people going for some exotic entertainment.
yes. And Elliot said, not sure this is relevant, but there are several books written about the Vancouver, British Columbia club scene around this time, which again is interesting. I didn't realize that Vancouver had a robust jazz scene.
Yeah, you did. And there are books on jazz in Chicago, jazz in Boston, there's a website in jazz in Boston, jazz in LA. But each one of those books is kind of an overview of what the music was like, the musicians, and they do get into the clubs, but they're generally not visually as visual heavy as this. And this is across the United States.
Yeah.
And only about the clubs.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a lens also to look at American history and culture, like a good novel. It's a lens looking at a time and place at a bigger picture than just jazz clubs.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, you know, you've another theme that came up a lot during the talk is external circumstances being a driver for change. And when I was going through the New York section, I kept thinking, I wonder what the external circumstance of, say, the pandemic will be for performing arts in general, jazz, anything. You know, this is on par with a war, depression, you know, prohibition, whatever you want to say, you know, and Black Lives Matter too. Like what is going to be the after effect of this? It's really interesting.
So, you know, there are going to be so many different things. I mean, you know, people seeing their doctors online, or just a small example of, like, you know, nobody's going to be driving across town to have a 15-minute or half-hour consultation with somebody that can be done online. And I'm sure
yeah, right. It's so true. We're although we might not love it, we are very used to this type of interaction now, and it does save a lot of time.
So things will change, and who knows how.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting. Robert Morbeck says, thank you, Jeff. This book looks incredible. Robert, it is an incredible book. Joe Holmes, hi, Joe from London. Were you able to, did you try to identify any of the people in the pictures who aren't famous, or would that be impossible?
Basically, it's impossible. Occasionally, one of the photos would have, you know, somebody's first or last name, but it would be like Lawrence Patterson, you know, something that, you know, and most of these people, I'm assuming, are no longer with us, you know, just because of or if not most, a lot. I'm kind of hoping that somebody writes to me and says, hey, that's my grandfather. But no, it's really, the only things we know about them are the meaning we can tease out of it. In the interview I didn't talk about, two interviews I didn't talk about, Jason Moran, who is a younger MacArthur Genius Grant winning composer and musician, but is also the head of the jazz program at the Kennedy Center and teaches at the New England Conservatory. I talked to him about what a younger musician with an eye toward history sees through this. And then I spoke to Robin Given, who's the critic at large for the Washington Post. She's the only fashion critic ever to win a Pulitzer. But she's really remarkable at deconstructing photographs. So can you put up that first slide of Charlie Parker at the Royal Roost?
Sure. Let's go back.
That's it.
Yep.
So one of the reasons I wanted to talk to her is she's so good at looking at a photograph and saying, have you considered this? What about that? So I showed her this picture and she said, all right, so look at that suit Charlie Parker's wearing. You see how his lapels are much bigger than the guy he's with? Yeah. She said, and they both have pinstripe suits on. You can barely see the pinstripes in the customers, but in Charlie Parker's, they're very bold and vivid. It's kind of an exaggerated version of a pinstripe suit. And I said, yeah. She said, so that's probably something he chose to be the equivalent of a stage wear because somebody in the furthest corner of the club would be able to see him clearly, whereas if he had a nondescript suit like the other guy's wearing, much less so. So there's a whole section in the back where she kind of looks at these pictures and teases a meaning out like that. That's as close as we could get to identifying people.
Yeah.
Which isn't close at all, but it's interesting to kind of stare at these things and see what you can discern from them that might not be obvious.
Yeah. Were you able, and I know I read in the introduction, did you know much about the person who had this collection initially, or you didn't?
Yeah, I know him well. He wants to remain anonymous.
Okay. Okay.
He collected this stuff over about 30 years. And then when I decided to do the book, about 20% of it are things that I found, including this photo of Charlie Parker, which was in an autograph auction. That's his signature on the top. And I bid on it, but it went for, I don't know, $6,000 or $7,000 or $8,000. Oh, wow. So I dropped out, but I made an arrangement to use the photo.
Cool. Any other questions for Jeff from the audience? I'm going to put sittin.in.com again in the chat so you can go to the website. You can take a look at that video. Also, you'll have the opportunity to order a signed book from Jeff from sittin.in.com. So that's the place to do it. And let's see, any others? Jeff, I think that means a good presentation. Especially
thank you all so much.
When our insiders are quiet. So insiders, before I let you go, just want to let you know about some upcoming events. One of which is tomorrow. We have a recent new addition that's come in. We're doing a virtual tour inside the former Bell Labs in Homedale, New Jersey.
That's really interesting.
It's a we're really glad we got it. We got it last minute, but we're doing that tomorrow. Time is, let me check because I don't even remember. That's how we literally put it up. It's at 1 p.m. tomorrow. That won't be me hosting. It will be another group. Then on Tuesday, I will be doing the virtual talk about the history and evolution of the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. And please, please, please join in. And if anybody has photos from the parade, from you attending the parade throughout the years, and you can digitize them or take a picture of them, I'd love to make them part of the presentation along with your memories of the parade. So you can send anything to me if you want it included to justin@untapcities.com or insiders@untapcities.com. It all goes to the same place. And then we will be back the first week of December with some great programming. We just teamed up with the Center for Traditional Music and Dance. We're going to be having a great winter of virtual programming and performances in partnership with them, but they are going to give us a devoted virtual talk and sample of what they are doing. Really, really great stuff with different immigrant populations, dance, music, and performing arts, all of which are trying to stay afloat during the pandemic and doing their own performances in their own spaces. So it's going to be really cool. We're excited about that. That's not on the calendar yet. We're getting the listing up hopefully tomorrow or Monday. So I know that was a lot. Thank you again, Jeff. Amazing. Sittin.in.com. Please go and take a look, learn more about the book. You will not regret it. Joe Holmes says it was so interesting. Thank you. And I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon and stays safe. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Have a great day, guys.
Take care.
Bye.